Petersburg.
At a time when you're struggling to pay your bills and meet your responsibilities, the least we can do is meet our responsibilities to produce a budget.
But the government doesn't have a deal yet as the deadline draws near.
Today is Wednesday, April 6th, and this is All Things Considered from NPR News.
I'm Michelle Norris.
And I'm Melissa Block. We'll look at what still divides Democrats and Republicans in their search for a budget compromise. They have 2 days left to avoid a government shutdown.
Also, our co-host Robert Siegel is in Tunisia, and he looks at the quest for free speech at a radio station after the fall of that country's dictator.
We cut the head, but the body of the animal is still alive. They are still powerful in a lot of administration. They are everywhere.
And from humpback whales to De La Soul, 25 recordings for the ages.
First, this news.
From NPR News in Washington, I'm Lakshmi Singh. President Obama rebukes lawmakers today for failing to lock in a deal on a budget and head off a partial government shutdown.
We've agreed to a compromise, but somehow we still don't have a deal. Because some folks are trying to inject politics in what should be a simple debate about how to pay our bills.
The president at a town hall meeting outside Philadelphia today urging Republicans to meet Democrats halfway or risk a government shutdown that could ripple through an economy that's still in recovery. The GOP leadership argues the White House needs to agree to deeper budget cuts. Negotiators tentatively agreed to $33 billion earlier this week, but House Speaker John Boehner is now pushing for $40 billion. Speaking moments ago to reporters, Boehner said Democrats, not Republicans, are the ones playing politics.
You got to remember that the Democrats had a majority here last year, super majorities in the House and Senate. They had the White House, and yet they failed to pass a budget. Matter of fact, they couldn't even agree on the budget after the election. And in December, they just punted until this month.
The deadline for an agreement to fund the rest of the fiscal year is Friday, midnight. If there's no deal, certain government services could start shutting down the next day. NPR's Ari Shapiro explains those workers unlikely to be affected are those whose funding does not come from an annual appropriation.
The Veterans Affairs Department, for example, is funded through a multi-year appropriation, so they'll keep working. The second group of people who will keep working is those who are necessary for the safety of life and protection of property. That includes military, law enforcement, and a lot of people in the Department of Homeland Security, which didn't even exist the last time the government shut down in the mid-90s. Senior administration officials say they estimate that the number of people who will stop work will be roughly the same as it was in the mid-90s. Now, they're still continuing to refine their plans, but generally they expect the figure to be in roughly the same area of 800,000 people.
NPR's Ari Shapiro. Engineers are injecting nitrogen gas into one of Japan's stricken nuclear reactors to help reduce the risk of another hydrogen blast. NPR's Richard Harris reports on efforts to stabilize a Fukushima Daiichi plant, which was crippled in last month's earthquake.
There has been no major explosion and release of radiation into the air in Japan from the reactor since mid-March. But with cooling systems still not working correctly, there is still some risk that the reactors can overheat again. That could generate explosive hydrogen gas through chemical reactions. By pumping nitrogen gas into one of the vulnerable reactors, engineers hope to prevent hydrogen gas from forming. The utility also reports it has managed to plug a water leak, which was letting radioactive water gush into the ocean. So, all in all, there is some progress in bringing the situation under control, though the International Atomic Energy Agency still says the situation remains very serious. Richard Harris, NPR News.
Before the close on Wall Street, the Dow was up 33 at 12,427. This is NPR.
Good afternoon. I'm Melanie Hirschhorn, WITF News. A Schuylkill County teen who testified against two others convicted of federal charges in the fatal beating of an illegal Mexican immigrant will spend 4.5 years in prison. 19-year-old Colin Walsh has been ordered to report to federal prison on May 6th. Outside the courthouse in Wilkes-Barre, Walsh told reporters he would become a better person. Walsh pleaded guilty to a civil rights violation in the 2008 beating death of 25-year-old Luis Ramirez in Shenandoah. He also testified against two other teens at a pair of trials. With less than 2 weeks until tax day, the Internal Revenue Service is recommending people file their taxes electronically as the fastest refund option. Pennsylvania spokesman Mark Hansen says taxpayers who file electronically and use direct deposit can get their money in as little as 10 days. He says people who file their taxes the old-fashioned way, on paper, will wait as long as 6 weeks for a refund and have to watch for errors.
You want to make sure that you're using the right Social Security number. You want to make sure you're spelling names correctly, especially if your dependent has a different last name than you do. You want to be careful of filing status errors. Of course, math errors and computation errors aren't as big of a concern when you're using software, but if you're doing it by hand, you want to watch out for those sorts of things.
Hansen says people who make $58,000 a year or less can use the free tax software. He adds this year people get an extra weekend to file because the deadline is April 18th. Berks County University has received a gift of more than $1.5 million from the estate of a longtime lawmaker. The donation from the late state senator Michael O'Pake is the largest in the history of Alvernia University in Reading. We're expecting rain and drizzle tonight, and Columbia County could get some light snow accumulating up to an inch overnight, the low 38. At 4:06, it's 46 in Lebanon, 51 in Harrisburg. I'm Melanie Hirschhorn, WITF News.
Support for NPR comes from Vanderbilt University Medical Center, using a patient's genome to develop customized blood thinner therapy at vanderbilthealth.com.
Support also comes from Mount St. Mary's University, where the faculty is dedicated to inspiring students to challenge themselves through a demanding liberal arts education. Online at msmary.edu.
This is All Things Considered from NPR News. I'm Melissa Blanc.
And I'm Michelle Norris. We're at 2 days and counting, and still no sign of a settlement to avert a government shutdown. It would happen at 12:01 a.m. Saturday morning. Talks continued in private between Republican and Democratic leaders. And on a trip to Pennsylvania today, President Obama warned about the consequences of a shutdown.
I do not want to see Washington politics stand in the way of America's progress. At a time when you're struggling to pay your bills and meet your responsibilities, the least we can do is meet our responsibilities to produce a budget. That's not too much to ask for. That's what the American people expect of us. That's what they deserve. You want everybody to act like adults, quit playing games, realize that it's not just my way or the highway.
This afternoon on Capitol Hill, House Speaker John Boehner accused the president of showing no leadership.
Our goal is real clear. We're going to fight for the largest spending cuts we can get. And the policy writers that were attached to them, because we believe that cutting spending will lead to a better environment for job creation. We're continuing to have conversations with our colleagues in the Senate. I'm hoping that they'll continue to go well.
Joining me now to discuss the politics of all this is NPR's Mara Liasson. And Mara, how far apart are these two sides?
Well, they're not very far apart on the numbers. It sounds like the Republicans are holding out for about $40 billion in additional cuts for the rest of this fiscal year. The Democrats wanted 33, but there is still that question of the policy riders that you heard John Boehner talk about. Those are things like defunding Planned Parenthood or National Public Radio or the EPA. They want those in there. The Democrats don't. The big question is, what number of Republican votes is John Boehner willing to live without? If he insists on getting 218 Republican votes, in other words, making a majority without relying on Democratic votes, then it's going to be much harder for him to compromise.
And angry people in his own party. Everyone says they want to avoid a shutdown, but it doesn't appear that everyone is acting like they really want to avoid that shutdown.
Well, there's a difference of opinion on the political consequences of a shutdown. Tea Party groups aren't worried about it at all. As a matter of fact, their battle cry is cut it or shut it. The White House is wary of the political consequences. They've seen the polls that show people think both parties would be blamed if there was a shutdown. John Boehner, who lived through the last shutdown in 1995 when the Republicans were blamed, are worried that his party will bear the brunt again. But the bottom line is that Washington will look dysfunctional if there's a government shutdown. If our elected representatives can't bridge their differences on 1% of the federal budget on a bill for the last 7 months of one fiscal year, how will voters and, more importantly, financial markets react to that at a time when they're trying to evaluate how able our political system is to grapple with the much bigger, longer-term fiscal issues like the deficit and the debt and entitlements? I don't think they'll have any choice but to see a shutdown as an utter failure of leadership
all around.
Let's stay with those long-term issues, Mara. Yesterday, House Budget Chairman Paul Ryan came out with his 2012 plan. Where are we in that longer-term discussion, and how do the two debates affect each other?
Well, there was some thought that once Paul Ryan's budget was on the table, and it represents a real conservative vision for the role of government, a drastically smaller public sector, many functions like health care for the elderly, Medicare essentially privatized, that vision would be so inspiring to the Tea Party freshmen that it would help Speaker Boehner convince them to just declare victory on